Turns out Christianity is not the only religious tradition to have a parable about mustard seeds. Today we start with the story of Kisa Gotami, a Buddhist story about a woman who is desolate because she has lost her only son. He has died. And she carries his body from house to house and tries to find someone who can revive him or resuscitate him, and no one can. And eventually she finds her way to the Buddha, which is because that's how these stories always go. And the Buddha says to her, "I can bring your son back to life if you can bring me a mustard seed from a house that has not known death." So, encouraged, she lays her son's body down because he was getting a little heavy to carry around, and goes back house to house and asks in every house whether they have a mustard seed, but more importantly, whether no one has died there. And I bet you know the outcome of this. Every house has known death. She does not find her mustard seed, but she recognizes in this exercise the universality of death and loss and the impermanence of life. And so she returns to the Buddha and joins his Sangha, or spiritual community. Last week I talked, of course, about the Gentile who converts to Judaism and joins Rabbi Hillel's community. So today we have a woman joining the Buddhist community. And even though this particular story is overwhelmingly understood to be about the universality of death, I personally think it's a great start to a sermon about grief, because it's also about the universality of grief. We all have grief. And yet how rarely we talk about it, how rarely we mourn publicly, except within the extremely delimited parameters of, a celebration of life or funeral or memorial service, or the little time at the beginning after whatever the loss is where it's considered acceptable, but after that the message we get is that it's not so acceptable. So we all have grief, and here are some of the things we may be grieving. We may be grieving the death of people who are beloved to us, the death of animals who are beloved to us. We may be grieving the end of friendships and romantic relationships. We may be grieving the loss of illusions about ourselves as we grow psychologically and spiritually and come face to face with those hard truths that we managed to duck for an awfully long time, but we can't duck them any longer. We may be grieving changes in our lives that we did not anticipate and do not like, thank you very much. And they may be in any parts of our lives. They may also include life in this congregation, which God knows has undergone many changes since I showed up in 2019. We may be grieving the state of our country, such as the loss of basic human rights by certain groups, or the loss of trust in institutions that we spent our whole lives building up that trust in, and now they seem untrustworthy. And I'm not just saying this, intellectually or theoretically. I know that I personally cannot even count the losses I've had in my life that I have not grieved properly. Now, grief is a really tough topic. So I'm going to try to approach it today with a degree of tenderness, a little bit of humility, not easy for me, but I'll try, and the desire to not cause anyone harm. I called this sermon Good Grief, which is a joke, but also not a joke. Anyone familiar with the comic strip Peanuts will know that we get the phrase from Charlie Brown. And if you are familiar enough with the comic strip and you think about when he says, "Good grief," it's virtually always an expression of frustration. Charlie Brown would be the last cartoon character to say that grief is actually good. And yet it is good. Grief is hard, but it's good because it is a measure of our love, as the hymn we just sang suggests. The deeper our love, the deeper our loss, the deeper our grief. That's not a bad thing, even though it's a hard thing. But grief is also good because it provides us with a kind of growth opportunity. The Catholic mystic Richard Rohr, who some of you may be familiar with, who has written some marvelous books and done some wonderful work, talks about the growth process as being one of including and transcending our pasts. So in his way of thinking, which I find really helpful, we don't grow by rejecting what we've left behind, by pushing it away, by ignoring it, by pretending it didn't happen. We grow by including and yet transcending it, incorporating it and yet moving beyond it. And so if you think about this as an odd analogy, but if you think about the story of how the Grinch stole Christmas, and at one point at the end, the Grinch's heart grows 3 sizes, which is great because initially it was 2 sizes too small, but it grows 3 sizes, so now it's a little bigger. Well, when we grieve, our hearts can grow around the grief. We don't lose the grief, but our hearts grow bigger than it, and they hold it and encompass it. And that is a good thing. Again, a hard thing, but a good thing. Now, grief is hard to talk about, partly because it's just so darn painful, but also in this society, we really do not learn how to grieve well. We really do not learn how to mourn, which is grieving in public, and we really don't learn how to support grieving people. One of the books I read in part to prepare for today was by the grief coach Shelby Forsythia. She has a book called Of Course I'm Here Right Now, and we're going to come back to those phrases a little later. But the first part of her book is about how hard it is for us in this society to support people who are grieving, and we can be really afraid to do it because we're afraid that we won't know what to say or we'll say the wrong thing, and that will actually drive a wedge between us and the person we're trying to support. And so it's easier to say nothing, but that doesn't help, and if we say the wrong thing, we might cause harm, and the last thing any of us wants to do is cause harm, right? So nonetheless, we have to think about how to grieve, how to mourn, and how to companion people who are grieving, and that is what today is about. The story of Kisa Gotami, with which I started, if we think about it a little more broadly, we understand that there's really a distinction between avoidable and unavoidable suffering. The suffering of loss itself is, unless you are some kind of spiritual master, not really avoidable. We're going to suffer and grieve when we lose someone or a situation or an identity or whatever it may be that was important to us. We will suffer. That's unavoidable. But Kisa Gotami adds to her suffering. She adds a whole second layer to her suffering by refusing to accept the loss and trying to get her son resuscitated. And what I find helpful is, if you imagine, I don't know why I imagine her as sort of a small bent over woman, I kind of do. But if you imagine a small kind of bent over woman carrying the body of this big strapping young man and dragging it from place to place, that physical burden is like a visualization of the emotional burden of the extra suffering that she is experiencing, not because of his death, but because she can't accept his death and grieve it properly and move into her future. And so in the same way, grief may be universal, but avoiding or rejecting it enhances our suffering. So we must learn to grieve well if we can. We must learn to mourn, and we must learn to companion each other. This brings us to the brief passage from Matthew. What I find really interesting about that particular beatitude or blessing is what Jesus doesn't say. Jesus does not say, "Blessed are those who grieve, for their grief will pass." That is not at all what this one-liner says. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And mourning is the outward response. It's how we express our grief after a loss. And my read on what Jesus is saying here is that those who mourn, not just grieve, but mourn, they will be comforted because they have been able to make their grief public, to take their grief public, and so they have become available to the support and companioning of other people, which I find an incredibly wise way to think about this. Before I go on with the sermon part of this, we're going to do an unusual thing today. I'm going to stop and read you a prayer or poem by Jan Richardson, relevant to what we're talking about. And then I'm going to invite us into a few minutes of silent reflection and, if you want, journaling about grief. We're not going to practice companioning each other today, but we are going to, if we want, there's no obligation here, but we are going to practice sitting with, and maybe if we want, writing a little bit about our grief. So I'll give you more instructions after the poem, or she calls it the blessing for the brokenhearted. And just for context, Jan Richardson lost her husband unexpectedly when he was very young, and she wrote a whole slew of wonderful blessings and poems about grief, and this is the one that really struck me. It begins with a quote from Henry David Thoreau, and the quote is, "There is no remedy for love but to love more." And here's Jan Richardson's blessing for the brokenhearted. "Let us agree for now that we will not say the breaking makes us stronger, or that it is better to have this pain than to have done without this love. Let us promise we will not tell ourselves time will heal the wound when every day our waking opens it anew. Perhaps for now it can be enough to simply marvel at the mystery of how a heart so broken can go on beating as if it were made for precisely this. As if it knows the only cure for love is more of it. As if it sees the heart's sole remedy for breaking is to love still. As if it trusts that its persistent pulse is the rhythm of a blessing we cannot begin to fathom, but will save us nonetheless." And now I'm going to invite us to take somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes in silence. You may think, meditate, you may ponder your griefs. If you don't have the bandwidth for that, you're welcome to use the time however you like in silence. But if you think you might like to journal, I'm going to invite you to come up and take a little notebook and a pen. If you do that, you are welcome to keep the notebook, and at the end of the 5 minutes, I will ask you to return the pen because I'm a cheapskate. But with that, let's take a couple of minutes and be with our grief. Available if you like. So that's a little bit about grief and mourning. We now want to spend some time thinking about how we companion the mourning and the grieving, whether that's companioning ourselves or companioning other people. And here we get to the book of Job. Job, that famous, upright, blameless Gentile. And by the way, I have to say, I find it fascinating that in the Jewish scripture, the person they told this story about was not one of their own. It was a Gentile from another country. But that's a topic for another day if we feel like it. Job loses almost everything when God and Satan make a bet. His livestock, his 10 sons. So if you can imagine Kisa Gotami's grief about her one son, you better multiply that by 10 or maybe even do it exponentially. I'm not sure. But God and Satan make this bet, which incidentally, if you were here last week for the Golden Rule, apparently God does not believe in following the Golden Rule in this story. Thankfully, it is only a story, a parable of sorts. So his friends show up. And most of the book of Job, if you have not read it, is about how badly his friends screw up in their ability to support him. But at the very beginning of the story, the part that I mentioned today, they do it right. They weep aloud, they tear their robes, they sit with him in the dust on the ground for a week, silently. This is proper public mourning. Might be a little more intense than what we are capable of doing. I don't think I can, sit in the dirt for a week. But in the story, the gravity of their support is equal to the gravity of his mourning because, as the scripture says, they saw that his suffering was very great. How then shall we companion those in grief, those who are mourning. I'll provide two kinds of guidance today. Neither of them are from me. They're from other people, but I find them really helpful. This first is from Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who I think actually Deborah Tinsley in our congregation has studied with or read the works of. But he has this material for companioning the bereaved that I think works really well for companioning anyone in any kind of grief, whether it is death or some other kind of grief. And you're going to see a pattern here as I read these. In each case, the doctor says to do one thing and not to do the opposite thing, I think, to make it kind of more powerful. He says, be present for the person's pain. Don't try to take it away. Go to the wilderness of the soul with the person. Don't take responsibility for helping them find the way out of the wilderness. Honor their spirit rather than focusing on their thoughts. Listen with the heart rather than analyzing with the head. Bear witness to their struggle without judging their struggle or trying to direct their struggle. Walk alongside them without trying to lead them. Discover the gifts of sacred silence rather than filling every moment with words. Be still with them rather than trying to move them forward. Respect their disorder and confusion without trying to impose order and logic. Learn from them rather than trying to teach them. And finally, bring compassionate curiosity rather than claiming expertise. And I think the overriding lesson in this list is that we are to be present with those in grief as they are, without any sort of agenda about what we will do. And I can't speak for any of you, but personally, when I try to do these things, on a really good day, I get an F, because they're really, really hard, and they are the opposite of what our society teaches. And yet I think it's deep and profound wisdom. Then I mentioned before the book, Of Course I'm Here Right Now, by the grief coach Shelby Forsythia. And I want to come back to the three phrases that make up the title of this book. All of them are a way that we can help someone, ourselves or someone else who is grieving, that challenge the kinds of inclinations the griever may feel that make things harder for them. So the point of these phrases is to avoid the avoidable secondary suffering. And the first phrase is, of course. Of course you feel that way. Of course this is impossibly hard. Of course you have no idea how you're going to get through tomorrow. Of course, of course, of course. And that, of course, is so important because it tells the person grieving, you are not crazy. There is nothing wrong with you. You are grieving. That's all, you're grieving. Of course you feel that way. Of course it's hard. Of course everything is in chaos. Of course you don't know where your next footstep will be. The second phrase is, I'm here. You are not alone in your grief. Because one thing I know, at least myself, about my own grief when it has consumed me is I feel completely alone. So we can companion the grieving by saying, not by saying you're not alone, which sounds like a challenge to them, but by saying I'm here. And that will signal to them that they are not alone. And finally, the last phrase, right now. All you have to attend to is the present moment. You don't have to worry about the future. You don't have to plan tomorrow. You don't have to get better, whatever that means. Let's just be here right now with the grief in the grief, honoring and acknowledging the grief. Jesus at a later point in the Sermon on the Mount reminds us that today's troubles are enough for today. And tomorrow will have its own troubles, so let's worry about tomorrow's troubles tomorrow. I don't know if he was thinking about grieving when he said that, but it works for me. Right now, we are here grieving, and all we need to do is be here right now. With that, I turn to our questions for the week and our prayer for us all. For anyone who is new or newish to our community, the questions for the week are questions I kind of hope you will take with you after the service, out of the service, into your week. Think about them a little bit. Let them work on you a little bit. And they're tough ones this week because it's a tough topic. What losses, and I will say, I'm going to use I language this week. So as you hear this, think about yourself, and I'll think about myself. What losses am I currently grieving? Could I go public with my grief and mourn? What might that look like? Can I ask for companioning from others in my grief? Who might be a suitable companion for my grief? How can I be a companion to other people who are grieving or mourning? And of course, the million-dollar question for us, how can this community teach us to grieve well, to mourn well, and to companion each other in our grief and mourning? I end, of course, with a prayer for us all, and again, for people who are newer, I call it that because God knows I am in need of this prayer as much as anyone else at this gathering or watching this recording later. May we find the capacity and the courage to grieve the many losses of our lives, personal, communal, and societal. May we find the capacity and courage to mourn, to take our grieving public so that we have a chance to release what needs releasing in the witnessing of those who care about us. And may we all become good companions to ourselves and others in our grief and their grief, so that we may witness well and be witnessed well in our grief, which honors our love and which is therefore good. Amen.